The fable is one of Aesop's best, The Crow and the Pitcher. It underscores the fact that we may have a rough go of it trying to figure out what, if anything, is so special about human thinking. The crow eyes the water, then sticks his beak into the pitcher to get a sip. He discovers the neck of the pitcher is unfortunately too narrow. He can only get his beak partway in, not enough to drink water. Crow's got a dilemma. In a flash of insight, he hits on a solution. The bird takes the pebbles and drops them into the pitcher one by one. This gradually raises the water to a level where drinking is possible. The crow sticks in his beak and drinks. Clever little tale. Oddly enough, it's not a fable. This Greek folk tale actually describes an avian behavior demonstrated in a research laboratory more than 2 millennia after Aesop. Only the scientists weren't Greek, and they weren't looking at a crow. They were British, examining a close cousin of a crow called a rook. The title of the paper describes the findings. Quote, "Rooks use stones to raise the water level to reach a floating worm." Close quote. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Why do I start this lecture with Greek crows and English scientists? Well, it has to do with the subject of our lecture, distillable to 2 questions. A, what exactly are unique human thinking abilities? And B, where did we get them? To answer these questions, I'll divide our lecture into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about what Darwin and later scientific colleagues thought about the issue. Next, we'll talk about origins, focusing on language and something called a false belief test. Finally, we'll talk about a cognitive gadget called theory of mind. Along the way, we'll discuss some more examples of animals caught in the act of thinking like humans and another Aesop's fable, underscoring the fact that scientists really need to join more book clubs. Some of this will seem familiar. As you may recall from last lecture, we already started on the road to answering these 2 questions. You might remember the ideas behind variability selection theory, VST. We became apex predator by our ability to adapt to change itself. And that's because the weather was as wildly unstable as the late George Steinbrenner, the legendary owner of the New York Yankees baseball team. Exactly what kinds of behavioral traits, by that I mean intellectual traits, would allow creatures to survive this kind of instability, and which ones would prove disadvantageous? How did we end up so uniquely smart compared to our other terrestrial brethren? Well, that's where the shadow lies. Okay, let's get back to the paper, the one entitled "Rooks Use Stones to Raise the Water Level to Reach a Floating Worm." The laboratory birds, when presented with Aesop's dilemma, behaved like Aesop's solution. The animals were given a container with a worm on the bottom, but the neck of the container was too narrow to grab the worm. So the rooks literally plopped rocks into the water until the level was high enough, and sure enough, they grabbed the worm. These feathered Einsteins even went a step further. They discovered large rocks worked better than small rocks, and sawdust didn't work at all. In homage to the fable, the researchers mentioned Aesop's tale in their abstract. We obviously have some explaining to do. So, what makes us intellectually unique? You won't be surprised to hear this. There's a great deal of controversy surrounding the topic. Some researchers think there's a giant cognitive firewall between us and everybody else, making us a separate and unique species of the planet. It's not that chimpanzees write symphonies badly and we write them well. Chimps can't compose symphonies at all, and we have composers that send us into the aesthetic stratosphere. That's a difference of kind, a firewall made of neurons. Some researchers think that's baloney. No neurological firewall sets us apart from others by kind. The separation only occurs by degree. They point to observations like that smarty-pants rook and worm experiment we just discussed. And rooks are hardly the only example of animals stealing something from the human cognitive playbook. Darwin appears to have a similar view. writing in 1871, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals certainly is one of degree and not of kind." To paraphrase Canadian researcher Sarah Shuttleworth, "As soon as you equip a snake with legs, you create a fundamentally different reptile. Some changes make all the difference." So, here you have researchers who think we are unique by kind, researchers who think we are unique by degree, and researchers who think we are unique by degree, but that strong enough types of degree lead to differences in kind. Who's right? The situation becomes even more complicated when we find animals that may have, in addition to sophisticated cognitive lives, sophisticated emotional lives. Some of those emotional behaviors are eerily familiar. I had a ringside seat to a particularly striking example of the emotional life of animals as a teenager. I once served as a summer fair cook. Next to the kitchen was a pond graced with two swans, which, as you may know, can mate for life. It was great fun to watch this couple. They cavorted together, fed together, raised kids together, and then late in the summer, sadly, one of the pair was run over by a cart. I watched the swan's partner react next day, wandering all over the pond, making loud honking noises, heartbreakingly trying to find his mate. This went on day after day. He never found her, of course, because she was dead. Eventually, he just took to staring listlessly at the pond. It was hard not to cry. It was also hard not to anthropomorphize. You have to be very careful how you interpret the behavior of animals intellectually or emotionally. I remember feeling so sad for this animal, but I had no idea if the swan was feeling the same loss that a person feels after losing a mate. They aren't human, after all. I bring this up as an example only to relate how complex a task you undertake when attempting to compare animal and human behaviors. You would do well to keep this tendency to anthropomorphize in mind when we get back to our discussion. True when talking about the mind or the heart. So let's get back. We are trying to answer the question, what makes us unique? Years ago, researchers declared that what set us apart from other creatures was the ability to make and use tools. You can't go into the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania and find a light rail system made by Jane Goodall's chimps. All you find are trails. Later researchers claimed what set us apart was the ability to plan for the future, invoking a process sometimes called mental time travel. When we save money all year long to visit a favorite vacation spot next summer, we do a form of mental time traveling. Others believed our uniqueness involved something called shared intentionality. This is the ability to infer what others in a group are thinking. This is done for the purposes of coordinating behaviors in the service of some goal. A good baseball team with a solid knowledge of their opponent's strengths and weaknesses is a good example of this. So is a wisely led army. There's just one problem with these theories when used to explain what sets us apart from other animals. They don't actually set us apart from other animals. You can find core, if rudimentary, examples of these abilities in many other creatures. Lots of animals use tools, for example. Dolphins put sponges on their noses as they grub around the ocean floor for food. That's so their sensitive schnozzes don't get injured. They can even teach their young to do this. Many animals plan for the future. Some birds cache extra food away as they anticipate times when the food is going to be scarce. Western scrub jays have taken this behavior to an art form. They remember not just where they buried their food, but when they buried it, the type of food that was stashed, and what rival was watching them as they buried it. Planning, a form of mental time travel. Some animals coordinate their behaviors with ease. Killer whales organize their hunts. Male chimpanzees actually form raiding parties, silently invading a neighbor's territory in single file, breaking out in sudden, terrifying ambush. This requires mental coordination, a form of shared intentionality lethal as the 82nd Airborne. What do we make of these behaviors? How do we define anything uniquely human? In part 2 of our discussion, we will talk about some research ideas that are gaining traction. They have to do with something that is happening to you right now, the ability to hear and understand the words on this video. When it comes to talking about unique human thinking, Aesop's crows seem to star regularly in research journals. The following fable, mentioned in the journal Science by Elizabeth Pennisi, is no exception. Here's a paraphrase. Once there was a crow in a tree carrying some cheese in her mouth. A hungry fox on the ground noticed the cheese and hatched a plan to get it. "What a noble bird I see above me," said the fox, pretending he was out of the crow's earshot. "Her beauty is without equal, if only her voice is as sweet as her looks are fair." The crow, vain to a fault, decided to show him. "Caw, caw," she said loudly, opening her mouth wide. This caused the cheese to fall to the ground. The fox snatched it up. As he swallowed, he ran off, looking back to the angry crow, yelling, "You have a voice, madam, I see. What you want is wit." Most everything I want to say in this section is embodied in this story. We begin with a glaring omission. As mentioned earlier in the lecture, about the only thing you can get most evolutionary theorists to agree on is the observation that very few of their colleagues agree on anything. That is patently not true of this section's topic, the human capacity for language. I mentioned it last because it represents probably the most solid approach to getting at the bones of the question about what humans can do that no other animal can do. We do speech like no other creature does speech. We communicate with a systematized collection of grunts and groans, the creation of words. We combine those words into nested sets like Russian dolls, layered in combination to form the disciplined practice of language. Useful, this language is. Those combinations can describe our past and our future, and they can describe things concrete and abstract. We have funneled this extraordinary talent into a form of immortality, using the twin recursive skills of writing down what we mean, then reading what we've written. We've codified these skills into an alphabet. This allows the freedom of our minds the luxury of generational portability. From an alphabet, we can create fine literature and tax returns. Many researchers believe the evolution of language was the Red Bull that accelerated our journey to the top of Mount Apex Predator, even though we are the wimpiest kid on the block. They believe the survival benefits of language are almost too many to count. Language allows us to organize hunting parties and standing armies. Language allows us to share information in a consistent fashion, communicating years of experience, even decades of experience, in single phrases and sentences, all digestible in seconds. We can pass on the wisdom of child rearing with language. Where to find the best tubers, the most abundant water, what to do if you smell smoke. Language provides a ridiculous advantage when the environment is as unstable as the data derived from variability selection theory says it was. You remember, that's the theory stating what we learn to adapt to was change itself. That teach me to fish stuff. If you can talk about what you're learning using a tool every bit as dynamic as the meteorological environment in which you live, you will live. No other animal can do this. We can teach some rudimentary language basics to a few, but there are no simian Shakespeares, no avian Faulkners, no cetacean Balzacs. It's why we're focusing on language. Differences in degree, maybe, but it morphed into differences in kind. The biggest question is, how'd that happen? What is the core gadget that allows language? What allows its motor analog, writing? It must be something very powerful because we're still speaking and writing. It must also be something unique because chimps are still not speaking or writing. Many researchers believe the core cognitive gadget was the ability to reason symbolically, and to do so in layers. Exactly what reasoning symbolically has to do with language and layers brings us to our last section in this lecture. Let's get into part 3, entitled Theory of Mind, and start by watching some television together. You have undoubtedly seen this commercial for the Volkswagen Passat. The commercial opens with a child in a Darth Vader costume. He's striding down a hallway to the martial strains of John Williams' Darth Vader theme. The boy stretches out his hand, trying unsuccessfully to manipulate his world using only the Force. He commands the treadmill to turn on, without success. The treadmill does not turn on. He stretches his hand to the family dog, who just lies there rolling his eyes. He tries to turn on the clothes washer, move his sister's dolly. Still nothing. Sadly, the Force is just not with the little guy. 30 seconds into the commercial, things change. Dad comes home driving a Volkswagen Passat. As Dad enters the house, the boy rushes past him and immediately stretches out his hand. Would it work with the car? The music gets quiet. The little boy's hands fill the screen. Suddenly, the car springs to life. Engine gunning, headlights flashing. The boy is stunned and looks on in disbelief. Finally, something worked. But not really. The camera focuses on the ignition remote in Dad's hands. Dad's inside the house, pressing the remote's buttons, looking out the window at his son with amusement. The screen flashes the VW logo and the price of the Volkswagen Passat. A thoroughly delightful minute has passed. Everything in this commercial works because of our ability to think in symbols. The Volkswagen logo is not a car. It's a stand-in for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Darth Vader's theme is not a group of sounds. It's an entire universe of cinematic nostalgia. Even being in on the joke, knowing how remotes work, is a type of symbol. After all, the remote is simply a small black rectangular box over which a thumb is pressed. There are even little car icons on the remote, layer upon layer of symbols. The commercial's name is The Force. It was created by Donnie Deutsch Advertising, and you can see it on YouTube. You really owe it to yourself to take a look. Here's why I say this commercial is a perfect example of symbolic reasoning. Symbolic reasoning is the ability to realize that one thing might actually stand for something else. That a logo, a sound, even the small pushes of a button may imply another thing entirely. Symbolic reasoning is so pervasive, it's possible to miss it. But it plays hardball with the rest of the planet. It may be the one thing that separates us from every other animal. Symbolic reasoning is in the bones of artistic expression. It lies at the heart of advanced toolmaking. It's the brains behind mathematics. There is no such thing as the square root of 17 grazing in the grass. We just made that up using symbols. Symbolic reasoning is at the creamy center of our language abilities, spoken or written. Here's how noted researcher Georg Streeter puts it. Quote, humans generally use their words not just to signal what is present, but also to talk about things that may not be in evidence. ... Uncoupling the signifier from the signified. Close quote. It's the ability to impute to something a series of characteristics that something does not intrinsically possess, as complex as Picasso, as simple as a car commercial. That may be the answer to our first question. What separates us from animals is the sophistication of our symbolic reasoning. It hits a line drive right to language. We speak uniquely because we can reason uniquely. So, that's the first question. As you recall, we're trying to answer two questions in this lecture. The second is, where did we get our uniqueness? That can now be distilled to, where did we get the ability to reason symbolically? Where did we get the ability to impute to something characteristics we cannot otherwise observe? There is no end to speculation, but many researchers agree that social interaction is involved, perhaps as a direct result of that wimpiness discussed last lecture. These researchers invoke something called a false belief test as an illustration. To understand false belief tests, we turn once again to children. Actually, we turn to a now defunct website called trueconfessions.com. It was one of many sites where you could post a short paragraph-length confession anonymously. The site, which you can still visit, is divided into subject sections, including a moms section. Here's a confession about a mom describing her little girl. My 2-year-old daughter was so cute today. My husband was watching football, and when his team made a touchdown, he got all excited and pretended to headbutt me, except I didn't expect it and moved, so he ended up doing it for real. It hurt. While my husband was apologizing profusely, daughter brought me her special blanket she never lets go of and her pacifier and shoved it into my mouth and made me lay down on her blanket to make me feel better. LOL. There are several notable things about this story besides the fact that it's thoroughly delightful. The first is that Mom's head got hurt, not the daughter's. But something stirred in the little girl's heart, exemplified by the second thing I'd like to point out. Daughter tried to make Mom better. She used the only tools she had at her disposal, her memory of what you do when something hurts. Wonderful, touching, human. The little girl obviously had the ability to take Mom's perspective. When does that happen to most of us? And what does that have to do with surviving the non-home field advantage of the Serengeti? The false belief test may help. There are many variations. I'll describe one sometimes referred to as the Sally Ann test. Only I'm going to call it the Phil and Jill test to make it more gender balanced. Let's say you're going to tell the story of Phil and Jill to a small child who is actually the experimental subject. Here's the story. Once there were 2 children named Phil and Jill playing in a room. Jill has a silver coin inside an envelope. Phil has a piggy bank. Jill leaves the room to use the restroom. In Jill's absence, Phil takes the coin from the envelope and puts it in his piggy bank. Then Jill returns, searching for her silver. Where do you think Jill believes the coin to be? The researchers ask the small child. Envelope or piggy bank? Does the subject take Phil's perspective, who knows where the coin is? Or Jill's perspective, who still thinks the coin is in the envelope? The answer is, it depends upon the age of the subject hearing the story. Most kids before age 4 fail this test. They say Jill believes the coin is in the piggy bank. That's normal. Small children believe their perspective is everybody's perspective. Children are delightful, but they are as narcissistic as movie stars. That's not the end of the story, happily. After age 4, something wonderful happens. Kids somehow realize other people can have perspectives different from their own. After 48 months, children routinely choose the envelope. They put themselves in Jill's shoes and come to a different conclusion. The core cognitive gadget is that they have begun to virtualize a perception. They are imputing to Jill her mental state, a world they cannot otherwise perceive. There's no reader board on Jill's forehead saying, I think the coin is in the envelope, even though it's not. The child has to make that leap, fill in that blank, connect that dot, impute to Jill a characteristic that cannot be physically seen or heard or tasted or smelled. The ability to understand the mental world of someone else requires the ability to virtualize, to imagine. And if you can hold in your head something that isn't physically there, impute to something a series of characteristics not readily perceived, you are on the way towards uncoupling the signifier from the signified. This is the left ventricle of symbolic reasoning. Symbolic reasoning also uncouples the signifier from the signified. This ability to understand the motivations and intentions of another is so important, we give it a name. We call it theory of mind. The ability to understand the motivations and intentions of another. Let me illustrate this concept by retelling a story I once heard Garrison Keillor say on his radio show, A Prairie Home Companion. It concerns a Lutheran pastor who likes hunting bears. The pastor decides to skip church one Sunday and go hunting in the hills. At the top of a ridge, he startles a mama bear who promptly chases the poor pastor down the hill. The pastor trips, loses his footing, and as the animal bears down, the pastor cries in a loud voice, "Oh God, I repent for neglecting my flock, but please do something. Make this bear into a Christian. In fact, make him a Lutheran." The bear suddenly stops, gets a beatific look on his face, clasps his hands towards heaven. The pastor is relieved until the bear speaks in a loud voice. "Oh God, I do thank you for the food I am about to receive." Put succinctly, theory of mind is the ability to understand the motivations and intentions of another person. In this example, the words of the bear tell us he's about ready to have a pastoral Sunday lunch. Through the bear's words, we know her intentions. We have a theory of the bear's mind. Though it's a complex concept, theory of mind has just two major components. A, the ability to understand the rewards and punishment systems inside someone else's head, and B, the ability to understand that the rewards and punishment systems inside your head are not the same as another's. But that person won't react like you do. They react like they do. I sometimes call B the John Medina second law of marriage. What is obvious to you is obvious to you. Many researchers think the false belief test measures aspects of theory of mind. Some think theory of mind and symbolic reasoning dip their feet into the same cognitive pool. There may be something to this. If you can impute to something a series of characteristics it does not physically have, you can do the following. You can draw a line. But with this imputing characteristic, talent you've developed, it doesn't have to stay a line. Put a dot on the top of it. Now it's a letter, which in combination can form words, which in combination creates language. You could draw another line. Now put a little platform underneath it. It becomes a number, the number 1. You could draw a circle next to your line. Now you have a different number, the number 10. Put those in combination to form equations, and pretty soon you've sent a man to the moon. It may be odd to say this, but there may be a direct link between our ability to understand each other and our ability to understand Shakespeare and physics. Tucked into this linkage is a bombshell of an idea that we'll observe in future lectures has deep practical significance. It means that the things that make us human come directly from the things that make us relational. Now we have an answer to both of our questions. One of the unique traits that separate us from all other animals is the sophistication of our symbolic reasoning. What blows me away is that its origins probably came from our ability to make friends. That's a unique fact, clever as a fox, and one that does not lack for wit. This reliance on theory of mind as an origin of symbolic reasoning is hardly a hit with no errors, but it has many testable components. So fundamental is this idea of theory of mind, some researchers believe its absence is a disability. Autism. One of the hallmarks of autism is the inability to form relationships because of the inability to detect social cues, the inability to have a theory of mind about someone else. And if that's the case, finding out the brain structures behind what makes us so darn social becomes extremely important to do. From it, we'll uncover a home run of an idea. We'll find what makes us human. In the next lecture, describing brain structure is exactly what we're going to do.